So I propose we take maybe 25 minutes, and that way we would finish at 5:15. Yeah? Okay. So if we take 25 minutes to essentially build on our earlier discussion, to continue, and maybe we could begin with some responses to what Andrea has just presented.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Andrea. I think you raised some important questions that I think would be interesting to continue sort of unfolding. And I immediately said that I thought that Kenneth should respond to this, but now I take responsibility for my thought, and we'll see if he wants to. Because I think what is interesting, I mean, artists who make meetings. I think the important thing is here also that meetings is part of the tools in a way, rather than the product. I think, although there's a lot of effort being put into these meetings and framing them and creating some conditions that these meetings can happen in other ways. And I think it's relevant to pay some attention to exactly what are these, how do you frame, how are these techniques being employed, and what can we learn from them? Because I think again and again they're also being reinvented. Both the ethical, actually I think that was probably something that could have been more unfolded, exactly the ethical conditions of how can a meeting take place. But for Sjersten's project, he talked about the pink room. And of course, it could in principle have been any color. There were some reasons, but I think still it makes a huge difference that you create a framework. That it's not just a formal or not, it's not just about color qualities and the potential meaning of color in this particular setting, but really also to claim that we create a space here where the rules of engagement has changed from the way it was before. I mean, we're talking about space in her case that was already in use, but she created a chance to even readdress that. And I think that's something that goes through the whole project, is also not just to accept the given condition of what, there's a plan, and actually it's not just about responding to the plan, but really basically also changing the whole logic of the plan, which is even changing the larger area that is addressed or is being planned, basically. So what I think it would be interesting to hear Kenneth's immediate response is that you have also use meeting as a tool, and you have quite a lot of different type of meetings. And I guess also the people you work with are very different groups. So it would, if you would just respond from your own personal practice, would you mind?
Yeah. Very intriguing. What I'll do then in response to your question is to maybe step a little bit out of that, to see meeting as one tool, and this thing about being frustrated from meetings, I recognize that a lot, and the productivity of them, question the productivity of meetings. So I just written up some other words that, what is going on here to me, there will always be a power play going on. Who says something clever? And I hope I'm not. And then there's, dialogue. I don't know how to phrase it, but and I can't really grasp it, but there's something about because the aim for me is dialogue. So meeting is one way of doing it. And how can you create, so dialogue for me is maybe, and maybe we can take it one step further to say, when do we produce something, when do we have a creative production? So when do we create something together? So there's dialogue on one level, which is more general, then there's, actually producing something worthful. And I think we all recognize these conversations we have with someone sometimes where this whole power play, is power play the right word? Yeah, okay. Is kind of put aside, and then we just kind of ping pong, and then things starts to happen that we never anticipated, and we didn't come with that when we began the conversation or the dialogue, but we just ended up somewhere where we actually produced some knowledge that wasn't there beforehand. Because here, I mean, everything I've said today is something I knew already, you know, kind of, I mean, nothing is produced. I mean, of course there is, but I just experienced this situation where it's easier to produce some new knowledge. And what I found is that I try to kind of, to find these situations or to produce this situation in my processes where that's actually produced something. And everything I said now doesn't really do very much, but I'm just trying to kind of differentiate different modes of producing knowledge, and maybe I'm questioning whether meetings is the right way to do it. And then I'm just interested in, when you talk about the public, which I think I understood as a criticism or something that, and maybe you can just talk about what community is then, or is there something called a community meeting? I mean, is that something that is more legitimate or existing or productive, or I don't know. Yeah, so it's just a lot of, I don't know, definitions, ideas into the pool.
Well, before responding,
maybe I have, because I'm sort of maybe continuing a little bit, also complicating it maybe, I don't know. I was thinking of the YouTube meetings, which were in a way, you defined meetings as a dialogue or a meeting between two or more people, so an interview can be part of that definition, no? So there is an interview between two or more people, Kirsten and somebody else, or maybe more people. And those interviews are being distributed, published. And then because of that, meetings are being called. No? From those meetings, voices that are already, I would say, as a seed, sort of became or gained some kind of self-esteem because of the listening, no? Because of this bigger gathering that they called for themselves as a reaction to these YouTube videos, created a bigger voice of assembly that produces something. No, I don't know if that's productive, I don't know if it helps, I don't know if it changes anything, but at least it produces something, no? And that brings me back to maybe the discussion that we had before the break. That brings me to the money question, no? Or maybe the money paired to power and paired to who decides somehow. And that we might, that's something that I think many of us maybe in different ways struggle with. And I talk from an example, in the 80s, 90s, something, I don't remember exactly. Up until that moment, there were lots of neighborhood groups in cities like Rotterdam, for example. I'm talking now from my own experience, probably there's something similar here too. Then people gained voices because public hearings, which is meetings, which is a city council talking to, there is still this hierarchy. But they were overloaded with people who came to the public hearings. So there is, I would say, in a seed of maybe, a start of let's say, at least a voice of the people. I don't know if you can call that democracy, if you can call that public, but at least there's a public engagement or an engagement of the people to talk and to out their opinion in the places where power is being defined, no? Then the neighborhood groups got cut by budget cuts for all sorts of reasons that we can speculate, we can say all sort of conspiracy and so on. And then there is a line, I would say, and that is where the money comes in, a line towards, let's say, in your example of the Goethe Institute, which is a body, a political body, but also a cultural body with budgets, no, that combine and connect different places and different cities Then we have the European community that has these kind of subsidies for cities connecting together. So I don't know where I want to go with this, you know, but I think there is something between that meeting that maybe starts as an interview with YouTube and then becomes bigger, etc., and the vice versa, or the other way, let's say, cutting it down and regaining, or maybe not regaining. I'm not sure if that's top-down or if it's regaining, let's say, a voice from a different dynamic somehow. So maybe a question.
Yeah, no, it's interesting.
Before going to Andrea, does anybody else wish to comment or? Yes. Oh. Sorry, now you're awake. Was there a question there? Okay. Yes. Brave soul.
I might have a comment to the meeting discussion. I think it was very inspiring the way you set up the whole thing, but I also think there might be a false dichotomy between the public meeting and the artistic meeting, so to speak.
Artistic.
Yeah. Because I think, as you said, we're used to the public meeting, that there's an authority, that there's a certain setup, and I think it's kind of difficult to get away from that setup, basically. So couldn't you say when an artist venture into a meeting setup, he will also be in the role of an authority, taking actually the same role. So my question might be, how do we actually get out of the norm of the meeting? Because I think when we're talking about meetings, it certainly have a society norm to it. And I don't know, when Kenneth Balfeld also is working with meetings, well, that could also be workshops or something else. So it's just maybe the typology to it. Is it clever to call it a meeting? Because a meeting might draw from a lot of norms we already have.
Absolutely. Is this? Yeah, great, thanks. Really interesting comments, everybody. It's interesting actually because the word assembly has come up also, and I know of course there are many other, and we have learnt from the questions and failures, as Angelica talked about, of the Occupy movement and various different insurgent groups, insurgent is the right word, there have been many, many experiments with these kind of ideas, formations over the past, well, I mean, historically there have been many, many, but in our period there have been many, many experiments with this. So the reason for me to focus on meetings is when I was thinking about Parklek, I was trying to distill, in a sense, down to the very kind of quintessential basis of what the relation was, the set of relations, and how in our struggle, our consistent struggle to find a viable politics in the artist's common world, in the artist's common role, I was trying to distill it down. And so, of course, me here kind of going on about meetings is me trying to kind of put not a different model, because of course I do this in the knowledge that many people here, in all our professions, we spend time in meetings, but also particularly because there's now this history of artists' work that proceeds by working with various different communities. Kenneth is the word you used, or I can't remember if it was Elizabeth or community, the idea of a community. And so what I'm trying to distill here is a way in which we can begin to think about a kind of intelligence of power that occurs between the artist. And I think you're completely right, that the artist has power. And, obviously Parklek is a very good example of this. It's Schuursten that can mobilize the hands in the bucket by putting different people together. I mean, it doesn't happen without this. The term catalyst is often used for this particular kind of role. It's very useful, and it should be mobilized. I think that there are kind of attenuations. There are different ways in which we can understand the way that power flows and also the way that finance flows as well in relationship to these things. And it's at that level that we need to have proper political debate rather than be talking about histories of public art or relational aesthetics or the debate between Kester and Bishop, although, of course, we've all learnt from it and it's a really important signifier in our collective history. So how can we work with museums, or how can artists work with museums, when there will be so much demand put upon them to have meetings with communities? Yeah, I mean, this is already commodified through the requirements that often public funders have for what we do, and people that run museums and galleries will also attest to that. I'm looking at Helena there. So, you know, and also, you know, kind of floating agencies as well. And we all have to negotiate that and get the work done through it. It is again about how you bring together a group of people that can put their hands in the pot and come up with the money. So that's a kind of model that's out there. Yeah, this is how it's done. This is not new. Okay, this is how people work all the time. Kent works like that. Big Van der Pol work like that. Schersten Bergendahl works like that, etc., etc. So what I'm trying to do is find a language that we can use as artists, art academics, curators, to develop a kind of a way of describing, at the bare minimum, an ethical relation that is often assumed to exist anyway. Yeah, it's like, oh, of course the artist has a better relationship with the community than the bureaucrat does. Well, that's not necessarily the case. So what is it that we bring to the table? What is it? And so in choosing the meeting, I'm trying to describe a space or a time in which something slightly different occurs that's more difficult to describe. It's much more difficult to describe. And of course, Kenneth, as you say, there are many different forms of meetings, and I don't know your practice very well, but I'm beginning to know about your practice. So I can't speak to that, but I know Big Van der Pol's practice very well, and I know that in the process of making work, of course, you have many different relations occur. So what I'm trying to do is describe those relations in ways that are kind of novel. I'm grasping for a language that we can begin to describe those relations in different ways, because I think the language we have to describe those relations at the moment is inadequate. We just grasp for community, or we grasp for, consultation, and we grab languages from other places and we try and fit it into this quite delicate and extremely difficult practice. And if we can say anything, and maybe we can't say this, that is different about an artist's work, and I say this not sure that we can say it, we have to be able to say that that relation produces something different from a bureaucratic relation. But maybe we can't. So this is why I'm trying to reduce it.
So we'll go here, and here. Okay.
I like Judith's role is to give the microphone to Kenneth. Is the mic on?
It's on now. Oh.
Yeah.
The claim is that when I go into a project with some citizens to do something, I don't have an agenda as such.
Yeah.
Whereas someone from municipality or a social worker or an architect would always have a professional or political agenda. I mean, of course I have an agenda, but the agenda is defined together. It's not a predefined agenda.
But
Maybe
I think we
say
need to examine the moment of going in. I think we have to get down to the really fine details. What is that moment of going in? And how can we describe that? Now, Levinas and Frantz Fanon have a very theoretical relationship to that. And it, you know, it has a Judaic-Christian history behind it. It has an anti-imperialist history behind it in terms of Frantz Fanon. This is the bit I didn't go into because we didn't have time. And it's also very romantic, yeah? You know, you come face to face with the other and the change happens. Well, can we examine that? What is that about? I mean, this is, you do have an agenda when you go in.
Well, what I would like to actually is going a bit back to James and Angelica's presentations, because I think one aspect that we could address here is that of citizenship. And what does it mean to become an agent? And I think there are already some structures in place where there are hearings and stuff so people can comment on city development.
Yeah.
But they don't, because they don't, well, for various reasons. So I think the first step of what Kerstin did in this project was really to get people to feel that they had something to say and they had something to contribute with, and that become aware that their needs can be put into, you know, can perhaps be met in these new structures. So in a way, I think perhaps first step was exactly this, more like one-to-one, and only later really the meetings worked. Because first you had to create a sense of urban citizenship, a sense of agency, a sense of also a relationship between the people who might be neighbors but actually perhaps never discussed these issues. And also the differences between the two part of the two different areas. So So the invitation, in a way, I think, was already a slow process. I mean, even fertilizing the soil to make these meetings possible was a slow process.
Yeah.
And there was a two-way, you know, as I see it, Kerstin had to change her understanding of what was already there, but the people who were there also had to change their understanding of what they were and what their voice would be in this. So I think even to think about what this meeting, already that we need to understand as a process.
I agree with that completely, but I'm trying to discuss the thing that comes before all that. So I'm trying to work out that move that begins it, you know. And the move often begins by somebody, an independent curator, coming to you and saying, I want to do a project with you in this community because there's gentrification, and already something has started. A financial transaction, a kind of psychic financial transaction has begun. And I'm trying to begin before that.
Yeah, I'll try to rewind a little because I would like to take kind of the idea of the meeting to kind of its central core, which is about dialogue.
Yeah.
And a lot of these type of practices has, by a guy like Grant Kester, been termed like dialogical practices. And it's not fairly my like theoretical offer here, so it's partly his, but I think it's actually a proper reading of what's going on here, because what is it that the city developers are not doing? And what is it that Kerstin is doing? Well, Kerstin said it herself. She was a listener. It was about listening. So that's the kind of one side of the dialogue. And I mean, how can a dialogue move into some kind of empathic production? That would be the question from Grant Kester. How can a dialogue develop empathy? And his like 2 steps of empathic production would be, first, it would be recognition. So the person opposite you would have to, and this address artists, but also I mean the dialogue within a group. So you have to recognize the terms and the reality and history of that person opposite you. Okay, so that's the first step. And if you do so, then you have fertile some ground for identification, which is the next step. So, and the identification is the transformative mode of the dialogue. That's when one person can identify and move from his or her own position to somebody else's and can recognize those terms, those needs, and those claims that might be there. So you could say it's a question for the artist of administrative beauty, you could say.
Yeah.
In that setting,
Yeah.
making those steps facilitated within that dialogue, so there could actually happen a recognition across and this identification across. And I think, I think it might address politicians and city developers as well. It's when they can identify and recognize the terms and the needs on or at the person opposite them that they actually is willing to change something in their models or their practice.
Yeah. I'm just to add to that, and there's a fantastic rendition of Kester's work. Actually, kind of also before that moment, within this area of ethical philosophy that is taken up very strongly by the postmodernists, is even before the mouth opens, it's the recognition of the face. And lots of, in black studies, for instance, this has become a very important debate. And it is being remobilized and re-looked at. It's been they're trying to wring the religion out of it and use it in a way. So I think it's very interesting. Yeah.
I'd like to continue from where Matthias left off and go back to what you said also about that before an artist like me enters into this situation, there is Helena and the institution of Helena and the thoughts and intentions that you made in arranging the formats that you give. If, for instance, in this case, you gave a lot of time. And I can think that if I go back to exactly where Matthias left off, I think, Matthias, that the thing that is also necessary is that we, working with art, recognize that it's a desert sometimes. We need the world. We need to engage with the world. So we need to recognize that we're sort of tired of ourselves.
Yeah.
There are many exhibitions, many of the formats that we use that are like repetitions in many ways, and we walk around and we say, yeah, nice, fine. We don't need to speak anymore with each other. And I think that in order to open the meeting, we need to have a necessity within ourselves to actually get oxygen from something else. And in the break, I spoke with my friend Kirsten here about the democracy. Democracy is the same, and we are the ones responsible for the politicians we have. We can look at the politicians, especially here in Denmark, and say, oh, they are idiots, but we voted for them. So I think it's also something to do with that relation, that we need to have these meetings because there is stuff we need to talk about.
I think this may be the last word.
It's a very big and interesting discussion with talking about democracy, but I was also interested in turning the spotlight from the citizenship to the institution, and also to have a critical point of view on can we change institutions from within, first of all, and how can meetings be turned into maybe movements? This is the two comments I have.
Oh, great. Do I have time to answer it?
If you wish.
Well, first of all, I think there's a difference between meetings and movements. but I think that changing institution, Kirsten's just, kind of pointed at Helena. And I think that it's from Marabou Parkin, and I think that I think actually, if I can begin to criticise my own talk, to get in first before you guys did, well, you already have, then I would say that actually, even me talking about the artist as a meeting maker is a kind of false premise. I mean, it's obviously strategic within this space. But I think that, of course, institutions are already changing because there are many very dedicated, not enough, but many very dedicated curator directors who are trying to change things. But they face a real upward struggle, I guess, in Denmark as well as everywhere else. I mean, I talk from a kind of UK and Swedish perspective, but my knowledge is in the UK, and it's virtually impossible to change an institution without dealing or dancing around the kind of the negotiation of bureaucracy. We were talking about this also yesterday in relationship to funding, which is why the money and meetings is such important things. But of course, the role of the curator or the agent within the institution is very important. Agent is a problematic word, of course, because also it suggests somebody who's doing something secretly. And I think that we don't want to be doing something secretly. We want to be doing something, in the sight of the world. James. Oh, is he allowed?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Well, with your permission, it's just shortening your time for refreshment, but we'll go with the conversation.
I've got it.
Do we have?
I was just thinking about one other element of meetings and art, and I wonder whether there's any, there's space to think about another figure of the artist at a meeting, which is that of the jester. We've been very serious here today, and we've spoken a lot about ethics and democracy and citizenship and assembly and all those good things. But there's also a role for the intellectual. Call her what you want. As the jester, as someone who makes fun of. And I just wonder what you think of that. I think that's very important, actually. I'm not sure where the space is for that. We're all very serious. Safe spaces today. Everything is very. But there is an incredibly great, I think, possibility for meetings to have a reflexive moment when ridicule is institutionalized. I was thinking about a Greek assemblies, just for a moment. So a Greek citizen in Athens, I shouldn't say Greek, but an Athenian citizen went to about 40 meetings a year. It was really a burden. It was a lot of work to be a citizen of Athens. You had to go to 40 meetings, right? And you had to decide all sorts of things. But one of the meetings that they went to, as long as there was a quorum of 6,000, was called the Meeting of Banishment. And it was really a wonderful thing because 6,000 people would come together and they would take a vote and they would decide who they would banish from Athens. And the Plutarch writes about this, and the example he gives of this sort of illiterate guy who approaches Aristides, who's one of the great, pillars of justice, and in the community, and says, "Oh, Aristides, would you please write your name on this potsherd?" That was what they used to count the ballots. And he says, "Well, of course I will." And he says, "Why do you want it?" "Because I want to submit it to the banishment, because I'm so sick of you as the just person." And sure enough, he was banished. And 10 years is what the sentence was. But interestingly, the banished person didn't lose Athenian citizenship, and at the end of 10 years, he would come back, and his property would still be there and all that. I just wonder, at the end of the day, do we have any room, yes, for banishment and ridicule? Sorry, a facetious comment before. Manage the refreshments.
But we are a little bit over time. There was some little bits of information I was supposed to give, but I'm not going to take up your time by doing that. But I'm just going to say, is it okay if I think we have email for most people. If we email you the information about the next event in the series rather than taking up your time now, but also to signal that we're hoping to fold in some of what has just been discussed here into how we organize that session in Gothenburg in the spring. Not as is. I mean, I think it's we're archiving it rather than my understanding is we're archiving rather than publishing directly. Yeah. Well, the question is to you guys: Can we have an archive copy? We're not proposing to disseminate it online, but can it be used as a teaching resource? So, for those of you who spoke today, I guess so. And then, but there was maybe one thing I would just like to pick up on because of the. Not to cut short the jester question, but just to flag that we are witnessing the democratic process in the nation states of Europe precipitate a massive lurch to the right. And we're seeing that being fed and nourished by various forms of racist discourses, and they have now become normalized in an extraordinary way. And I think that we cannot lose sight of that we are now in a place which I think 10 years ago it would have been hard to imagine that certain things that we hear in the media, certain things that we see as just normal everyday discourse could happen as they now happen. Ideas and ways of speaking that we thought were somewhere back in 1930, 1931, 1932. And it is we are in a dangerous time. And I think we have to be very careful of how we talk about democracy, because if we think of democracy as simply majoritarianism or the removal of difference, we're all the same, or if we think of power as bad, how do we contest the loss of power that we witness, the loss of power that the progressive voices in Europe, America, and elsewhere in the world have lost? How do we contest power if we think power is fundamentally wrong? And I think we're in dark times, and we need to consider this. And I would ask that, as well as this question of the gesture, the question of how humor and the body are part of our political armor, that we also think that it is to be alert to the time we are in, to be alert to what is happening, and to find languages to talk of the places we are in that do not produce they, them, those, that we cannot risk that rhetoric. So let us go and have them. One last thing. Earlier in the day, I had said that in picking Park Lake as the focus for our research project, we weren't saying this is it, this is the center. And that's not quite true, because in picking Park Lake, we were very careful to pick something that we both had confidence and faith in as a real inquiry, as something that was open to critique, but also confidence in entering into a dialogue with Kerstin, that she would bring her work into these discussions in a way that was not protecting it from critique, that we could talk about co-option, we could talk about these things in an open and careful way. And I'd like to say that that is quite something for an artist to do, to be willing to actually bring attention to the work, but not to place limits on how that attention plays, that the critique can be critical. And I think that we've seen that play out today, and I hope we'll continue to see that in Gothenburg later in the spring. So thanks.